we're giving more power and agency to people living with a condition to be part not only of their personal treatment and care, but to be influencing what are we doing? What are the questions? How are we doing it? And how is research happening? So that's
Research isn't a solo act, it's a team sport, and for too long, the most important players were sitting in the stands. So what really happens when we stop treating patients like test subjects and start treating them like teammates? When a person living with a condition helps shape the question, design the study, and even rewrite the consent form. This isn't charity, it's expertise. My guest today is Anne Simard of the University Health Network in Toronto. She is a staff scientist and director of research at the Ted Rogers Centre for Heart Research and Transform HF. She'll be the first to tell you the real wisdom in the room often comes from people who've been hospitalized and not just published. This conversation matters for anyone who's ever wondered, how do I do more than just show up for a study? How do I help change what gets studied in the first place? Please welcome Anne Simard. Hi, Anne, and welcome to Let's Talk SADS Live. You and I have known each other for many years, so full disclosure, I have been a research patient partner many times under your guidance. So we have a familiarity, and I'm really happy that you're here today. Also, I became aware that it is National Clinical Research Week. So how are you celebrating?
It's a good time. So first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's always so much fun to work with you, and I always love the insight that you bring to every project. So this conversation is a really one I'm looking forward to. And I think, National Clinical Research. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is the role of patient partners in research. So perfect timing.
Yeah. So what festivities are happening in your world for this auspicious occasion?
Yeah, so there's been a couple like research forums where people are kind of coming together talking about some of the burning issues. And of course, the thing that nobody thinks about in research, we always think about the big discoveries, but the machinery behind research. So there's been a lot of kind of like, getting up to speed on new innovations in research ethics and that kind of thing. So for the geeks who like clinical research, it's a celebratory week.
Well, congratulations. It's well deserved. So right off the bat, we talk a lot about community in our podcast, about coming together. Why should a person with lived experience get engaged as a partner in research? What benefits come out from getting involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I think is kind of central to this idea, and I think it's also central to community, research is a team sport. And, it's not something that, this notion that somebody is off in a lab doing something on their own with nobody else involved is a complete fallacy. Research involves a lot of people, especially nowadays, because it's complicated, because it's expensive, and often it's hard to get the money to do research. So, you need people who are the researchers, you need clinicians, you need people who know about the methods. You need a lot of students. Usually they're often the engine of scientific research. And then as part of that team, you need the people who actually live and know a condition. So the idea of a patient partner in research is it can be a caregiver, it can be a family member, it can be a person who's personally, living with a condition, but they are part of that research team. And so to me, it's like embracing the concept of team, but expanding it in a new and different way. And also, we're at a time where, the passive patient who just, nods their head and says yes, to their doctor and doesn't ask questions, I'm hoping we've left that time behind. It's not always easy, to question, to test. But the idea is also that we're giving more power and agency to people living with a condition to be part not only of their personal treatment and care, but to be influencing what are we doing? What are the questions? How are we doing it? And how is research happening? So that's kind of like, to me, patient engagement in research is about broadening the concept of the research community.
And how is this change? Is this a new change? Is this something that has organically come about, or because when you think way back, it seems like there was only one group of people being studied. What is it? Male, stale, and pale.
Yes.
So, what brought this about to get patients or people with lived experience with more included in research?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, unfortunately, we're still haven't reached, the point of parity or equity where, we're studying as many conditions that affect women as men, have as many women participants as men, but we're getting better. And I think, all of the other dimensions of being able to truly represent the population, but that's maybe we can come back to that one. The concept of patient engagement in research, I would say, we're probably about 15 years in. And it was originally kind of part of some work that was led mostly in academia, where they kind of were saying, we're missing the most important component and the most important voice, and that is the voice of the patient in research. And then what happened is, like I was saying off the top, like research is not an easy undertaking and it's not inexpensive. What happened is the research funders in a few different countries, primarily in the UK, the US, and in Canada, basically said, we need a bit of a framework so that researchers start doing patient-oriented research and patient engagement in research. And in Canada, that happened in about 2015, so about 11, 12 years ago. And so basically what happened is they said, here's what this looks like, here's what the expectations are, and if you want this research funding, you need to operate in this way. And so there started to be kind of some momentum. I would say it hasn't perfectly permeated all types of research and all research funders, but we've come a long way. And, sometimes in Canada, you'll hear people talk about SPORE, which is the strategy for patient-oriented research. And that is the group that is really across the country trying to mobilize a community of people who really embrace and practice patient engagement in research.
Is this something that you're finding that, you engage a lot with students? Is this something that they're also seeing the value of and that are maybe pushing older researchers? Like, is it a generational change as well?
I think it's both like a push and pull. I think, for younger researchers, it really depends. And early career researchers, like people who are, who just graduated or in the first, 5 years of their practice, they're a little bit more familiar with it. I would say, people who research in certain avenues tend to embrace patient engagement a lot more. So if they do more qualitative research, if they, so they're doing interviews and they're doing focus groups or they're doing world cafes and they're bringing people together, they right away, would be into it and get it. Or if they are researchers who do community-based research, so you're trying to understand the effect of sleep apnea and heart failure in people who are precariously housed. So you're working in the community, you've got community partners. So already, you're thinking outside the ivory tower. I think we're getting a lot better in clinical research. So, the world that I live in. So I'm a scientist and the director of our research program at University Health Network. And so, in a place like UHN, which is very huge clinical enterprise, how do we bring in patient partners? And that's where you come in. We could maybe talk about some of the things you've done. But I think like a lot of other areas, they're still struggling to figure out how do you bring in patient partners? Like if you're a basic scientist and you're looking at mechanisms of, how does inflammation affect cardiac disease? You'd be like, why would I talk to a patient? Like I'm looking at a cell, right? So there's like some disconnects there.
I think a lot of people probably are entering this conversation thinking, oh, research, that means you're going to take my blood or you're going to measure something. Like that's how I'm going to be involved with research. But you've just described a few different, projects. Maybe we can go a little bit deeper into some of the tasks that
sure.
If a person wanted to participate, what's the spectrum that you can be involved with? And maybe I'm happy to talk about some examples I've done, but let's, start with what you give us the
Make
scope.
It real.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you go back to the first thing, where I said it's really being part of a team, on a team, there's lots of different roles. And in a project, depending on the type of project, the patient partner can play different roles. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Maybe I'll start with one that you will know very, very well. So we recently published a study called True HF, where basically we were trying to use data that comes from an Apple Watch. So, folks may wear an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin. And we tried to figure out, can we use that data to create an algorithm that predicts when people are going to get worsening heart failure, so what we call decompensate, and then before they get worse, bring them in and intervene. And so that study went on for several years. We just published it, but we've been working on the next study, which is called True HF2. And in this study, we wanted to basically not only just collect the data randomly, but we wanted to validate our algorithm. And if the alert happened, we wanted to bring people in. So in that study, as we've been working over the last, 2 years, maybe, Heather?
Yeah.
Where we were developing the protocol. So what's going to happen? What are all the things that a patient's going to have to do? What is this patient app going to look like? Yourself and our other patient partners have been kind of part of that journey, right? Like, what are all the steps going to be? Is it too much? Is it too little? Does it make sense? What does the app need to do? What kind of alerts does the patient need to have? Or even, what does the patient guide that tells me the steps right? So all of those things are things that you can maybe talk about that, have been part of the conversation. And every step of the way, your input has shaped the way the protocol works, the way the app works, and the way that we're going to actually implement the study when we get going next month.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, because I remember being, sort of soup to nuts, like what was the whole interaction for the patient interfacing with this program. So we saw the early designs of the app, so we could see the little bird going on from one signpost to the other to show progress. We read the user guide, and we're giving feedback on where to insert maybe different language or an image instead of words to make it really easy for people that were low tech. We actually got the watch and had to wear it 24/7 for a number of months. So just getting used to always having the watch on and giving feedback about that experience. And I think when we get back to sort of this idea of being in community, what I certainly benefited from was not only giving valuable input, so I felt empowered to speak up, but also just getting to know other people's experience who also live with heart failure. It's not a cookie cutter thing. So everyone has different symptoms and how they manage it. And I found I got a lot of info, just to help me be better at managing my own condition.
I think that's very true. And I think one of the things that speaks to is, when is more like the practice of patient engagement, where, if you're going to engage patients in a project or be a patient partner, I think it's always good to make sure you're not the only one. So, depending on the project, and in that project, we had 4 of you, very different experiences. Some lived locally, some lived far. Like, we were trying to get different perspectives. But I think it's always good to make sure that, the patient perspective isn't resting on the shoulders of one person, right? Because, obviously none of us can speak for the experience of all of us. And, heart failure is not homogeneous experience. And so, you really want to be thinking about both when you're inviting patient partners, but also I think when you are a patient partner is, yes, I have my own experience, but what have I learned that I think is a more broad consideration and more broad concern, or a potential for improvement, that I can bring to this research project? So I think, yes, community is very important when you're in, so that you're part of the team, but you're not the only patient partner, because I don't think that's ever a fair expectation to put on anyone. And also, you're very strong. You're very good communicator. You're very comfortable. Not everybody is, and so sometimes, you need like a buddy, or you need somebody to kind of be like the other patient, so that we can kind of like together kind of reinforce our messages. I think that's also very important.
Can you think of an example where participation by a person with lived experience has, really fundamentally had an effect on the research?
Oh, for sure. I can give lots of examples. So like, I'll give you like different types of scenarios. So, in a qualitative project that we did, where we had a series of questions in a focus group. Basically, the patient partner totally rewrote the questions and sort of changed our approach to the focus group. So, they were involved early on. I think we were going down a route that we were using this framework. It was way too complicated. And she totally brought us back from the brink and redirected us. So that's one example. Another example I can think of is we're doing a study, which actually right now is recruiting, which is looking at the relationship between heart failure, like cognition. So just, your executive function, your memory, your information retention, and also looking at blood pressure. And so the two patient partners in that study helped us like really frame out, how the flow of the study worked. Because we had, a patient who was participating, so not a patient partner, but somebody participating had to do a number of things. They really said, like, this is too much. You need to structure it this way. You need this flow. And then they also helped kind of the way that the clinical research coordinator was going to interact with patients. They helped to change the consent form. So lots of parts of the process that they informed. And then the third example I'll give, which is from a digital study. So we do a lot of studies because one of my roles is within this network called Transform HF, where we have lots of trainees, and they develop like lots of, point of care testing. So, the perfect example is, lab on a chip, where you give a drop of blood and or they develop wearables that are trying to do, like, it depends what they are, but sometimes you wear them on your head, sometimes you wear them on your arm, sometimes you wear them around your chest. And so patient partners have been intrinsic, because especially if you're a master's or even a PhD student, and you're an engineer, you've probably never met a patient apart from your family in your life, right? And so you have all these great ideas about all this tech you're going to bring in, and it's going to be so sexy. And then the patient's like, that is terrible. I would never do that. That would be intimidating. I don't, So sometimes the patient partners will go to the lab, hang out with the engineers and figure out what they're trying to do. Sometimes they'll test stuff before we develop a study protocol. So those are kind of like some very concrete, and trust me, for the trainees, there's been a lot of shifts and divergence that they didn't expect, because they'd never encountered an actual person living with heart failure before. So really changed their approach.
Let's talk a little bit about go back to this importance of diversity in research, because one of the things that I became alerted to was a lot of the wearables were only really designed initially to interface with like two kind of skin tones, like white or dark, but no gradations, which isn't really true for our society. Can you think about examples about how it's added different voices? Especially, I know that you do work in Indigenous communities, and maybe just speak to that, the importance of bringing in more people.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there's sort of like two different aspects to it. One is designing research for equity, in the sense of designing research that touches and is applicable to everyone, right? So your example of skin tone, there's some of the projects that we're doing that are looking and really thinking about how does light go through skin, right? And is a device, including some of the medical grade devices, is it as accurate in somebody with very dark complexion as somebody with very light complexion? So that's kind of like one world where that comes in. And obviously to do so, you need to be thinking about, how do you reach those communities? If I think about some of the more like focused research where you're really trying to, for example, hypertension is a massive issue in the Black community, and you want to do research where you engage, in Toronto, for example, the Afro-Canadian communities that are also very diverse. In order to do that, you need to be involving patient partners who are from that community and know the dynamics, right? So, where are the places to find people? What are the concerns? What's the attitudes in that community? And then what might be some of the concerns that we need to really think about? And then also patient partners would say, we know our community, we know our people, you need to recruit here, and your materials suck and they make no sense. And you need somebody who goes on the radio and, talks at the Caribbean Festival about this in a good way. So just kind of like some of the examples. I think for Indigenous communities, and we primarily do work for First Nations communities and with First Nations communities in Northern Ontario. So from the banks of James and Hudson Bay all the way across to the Manitoba border. There, it's a slightly different, I think. I think some of the principles still apply, the notion of nothing about us without us. But there we do different research methods, and we do them in a different way. So, I would give an example of one of the Indigenous methodologies is a sharing circle. So people come together in a circle, and it's facilitated by a community elder. And the conversation is really kind of happens in a very different way than in a Western way, where, I'm interviewing you and So it's a very different approach. Sometimes you pass a feather, or you pass a sacred object, you open and you close in a different way. And so for patient partners, they own that in many ways. And so the way that we approach it is very different because it's really, in some ways, a giving over of the process. And the whole process is designed really in a complete co-creation way, with often more leadership by especially the elder, if they're facilitating, than by the researchers. So I think there's lots of different ways that it can happen. And I hope those examples address
those are great examples. We come to these projects with our own experience, but is there any special background or training that someone needs to have to be a patient partner?
I would say there's no there's not a certificate that you have to have in order to do so. I think it is very useful and helpful to do training beforehand. So some things do require training. So for example, in Transform HF, we have a number of research competitions, and all of our competitions include patient partners on the evaluation panel. So in order to do that, there's a few modules that you have to do, on sex and gender in research, and on kind of like conflict of interest and confidentiality in research. So, those are like short, 30-minute online modules that you would have to do. I think in general, we don't do a very good job in most clinical research and other research in training patient partners. There's been some efforts funded by SPORE, that Canadian network. It's not consistent. And I think depending on where your community members are, it kind of depends what's happening locally. We do an annual training series because patient engagement is so central to everything that we do. And we really try to first kind of like make people understand how the research process works, understand the expectations, understand their role. But there are some good online resources that we can share afterwards if that's helpful. But in my mind, if I was a patient partner, I'd want training. And then the other thing I would want like a clear set of expectations about what you want from me. What's my role? What's the timelines? What can I expect from you? And what do you need from me to be part of kind of like getting ready to be a patient partner?
Yeah. Now, is this something that patients or people with lived experience should expect to do for free? Or is there compensation? Is there acknowledgement of their contribution? Like, how does that work? Because no one wants to talk about that sometimes and may be embarrassed to ask, but
No.
it's a real thing for people if they have to travel or give up some time of their day. How does that work?
So I would say inconsistent at best would be the answer. There's how it should work, and then there's how it works. So if I go back to, I was sort of talking about how at a national level, we have this framework. So SPORE has a set of guidelines about recognition and compensation of patient partners. And just to be very clear, here we're saying and we're recognizing that as a patient partner on a research team, you bring an expertise to the process, and you bring your knowledge, and you bring your time. And for all of those things, you need to be recognized and compensated. Just like me, I get paid to do this. You're not getting paid. It's not your day job. And so there's like an hourly rate. I think now it's $40 an hour nationally. And within that hourly rate, sometimes, if you do a day or a half day, there's different rates. But yes, there's policies, there's frameworks. And within our program, we do have a policy, and we do have practices. The people often are like, can you pay for my taxi? Yes, of course we can pay for your taxi. That's not compensating you for your expertise. So, I think, yes, you should expect compensation. You should have a conversation about it. But also, like, it's not just money, right? Do you want to present the results of this research? Do you want to be an author on a manuscript? Do you want to be one of the co-authors? Do you just want to be recognized and appreciated once in a while with a nice conversation, right? So there's lots of different ways. I think money is the one that is often a challenge because, as I said, the way research works, it's expensive and not everybody builds it into their budgets. We expect that in our competitions. And we certainly cover a lot of expenses for patient partners, but not every institution is the same. But you should absolutely be valued and recognized and compensated in the way that's important to you. Because a lot of patient partners are like, I just want to give back. I really care about this. I've had amazing care. I just want to give back. And that's okay. That's a gift. But for some people, sometimes they're on ODSB or they're not working, and, having a couple extra $100 makes a difference, and they should be compensated. And that should be part of the conversation too.
Is there anything that a person with lived experience should watch out for, be aware of, or challenges that they might have getting involved as a research partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, every teams work in different ways. There are amazing high functioning teams, and there are crappy, not so fun teams. And I think, the same is true of the research enterprise. I think, one of the things that's really important is when you're getting involved, like, okay, hi, hi, Heather, I want you to be involved in this project. You want to make sure, like, who's my point person? Like, when things get bumpy, who do I talk to? And who's going to problem solve for me? And then the other thing I think you want is you want to make sure that you know who the principal investigator is. So on any big or any research project, there is one person who's the principal investigator, and they kind of like got the money, they got the grant, and they're the boss, and they will often set the tone. So, does that person say, hey, Heather, what do you think? Does that person, make sure that they're accommodating and saying, you know what, I think we need a patient perspective on this. What do you think? Have you read the protocol? What changes would you like that makes room for you and isn't just bulldozing always with like the science? I think not that patient partners don't comment on the science, but I just mean that there's equal room at the table for the perspective of the patient partner. And, where people get really frustrated is I sit there, nobody ever asks my opinion, nobody talks to me, they completely forget about me. And then I don't hear from them for 8 months and I have no idea why not.
Right.
So I think, make sure you understand, what's going to happen. Like poor Heather and the other patient partners on our True HF study, we do it, you submit it, then you wait 8 months to find out whether or not you got the money. And then sometimes you don't get it and you got to resubmit. So sometimes it's a long game. But I think if you know what's happening as a patient partner, you can stick it out. But you have to be part of the conversation. And if you don't feel you are, you need to know who to talk to. And sometimes it's just not a good fit, and that's okay too.
So, hearing all of this, some people might be quite excited to be part of it, despite some of the challenges. I can advocate that it is a wonderful experience. It feels good to give back in this way. I think you get a lot out of it as a person with lived experience. You feel like you're moving the science forward, perhaps even a cure forward, or at least the treatment and the monitoring of something. What opportunities exist, and where should someone go? Like, you got them all excited. Now, what's the next step? Like, where can they find to be part of this world?
So it kind of depends where folks are situated, right? So, obviously your audience is not only Canadian, not only our little neck of the woods here in Toronto, although, some people seem to think we're the center of the universe, but it's, broad, it's national, and, lots of different people have different interests. So I would say in the heart failure space, one of the great places to find out about what's going on is to tap into HeartLife, which is the national patient advocacy organization. And I can certainly give you some links for folks. We, within Transform and within UHN, we post what we've got going on, both in our newsletter, which is on the Heart Hub, and on the Heart Hub. And in Transform, we obviously, if you're part of the newsletter and our events, we're often making calls for patient partners in research. And then we also have lots of patient partners. We run a big training program for PhD, postdocs, and master's students. And so within that, we're often looking. But the other thing is, if you're not in any of those things, but you live like in BC, but are you part and getting care at a hospital that is an academic health science center, or in Hamilton, or at Dalhousie, at QE2 in Halifax? Talk to your cardiologist and find out, how do I tap into the research that's going on here? I'm interested in being a patient partner, because if they're an academic institution, they will have research going on that may open avenues for you as a patient partner. So those would be some of the ways to go about it.
That's great, Anne. Thank you for that direction. And we'll put those links in for people who are looking to find out more. So just to wrap up, you have devoted your career to this. What do you personally get out of this in your role and your involvement?
Oh my gosh. Well, at the end of the day, to me, it's about relationships, right? And so much of the work you're doing, the whole reason you're doing is because you want to make it better for people who are living with heart failure. And so the patient partners are like the voice that I have to listen to because I don't have heart failure. I mean, I'm the daughter of somebody who had heart failure, who died of heart failure. And my other parent also has cardiovascular disease. So I've lived it that way. But I think to me, what it brings to me is it just brings like a truth and like a humanity to it. It helps, I think, it helps us be compassionate in what we're thinking about. It helps us be realistic. And it helps us, I think, really think about not only the research questions that matter to people who are living with this every day, but also like think about like, what are we expecting of people? And does this, like, just because we think it's sexy and fun, like what a dose of reality, our patient partners bring, for which I am so grateful. And then just like these beautiful friendships and journeys that I get to be part of, those are all the things that it brings to me.
That's a great conclusion. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anne. It was a really illuminating conversation. I hope we have inspired some people with lived experience and their caregivers to get involved. I think, it is a true gift, I think, to give our time. And thank you so much for your guidance today.
Thank you.